Ordinem Et Per Gloriam, The Chronicles of Captain Boris Pantalus. Prologue, The Storm over Castoris. The skies above Castoris Secundus had been lost long before the first salvo. Black clouds hung congealed oil slicks over the fields of debris, streaked with pale lightning that brought no thunder, only a distant, sickening rumble from the depths of the atmosphere. In this darkness, the war burned like a wound that refused to close. Captain Boris Pantalus stood on a shattered bastion tower of the outer defensive line and gazed silently down at what the tactical data feed soberly referred to as Front Section Delta 9. In reality, it was a valley of rubble and ashes, a ravine of destroyed tank wrecks and torn defensive trenches. Between them, the orcs crawled like a green plague. Contact in 42 seconds, Brother Sergeant Macarian reported over the Vox. His voice was distorted, as if he was speaking from a coffin. Horde formation, mixed infantry, no visible vehicles. Confirmed, replied Pantalus. Fire sectors as discussed. No retreat without orders. Per ordinem et per gloriam, murmured dozens of voices in chorus. His armor, Marktex heavy, pockmarked, creaked softly as he turned away from the edge of the bastion. The hourglass seal on his belt struck gently against the armor plates, each movement producing a muffled, admonishing clang that reminded him how little time remained. Not for Castoris Secundus, not for his men, perhaps not even for him. Chapter 1, The First Assault. The orcs struck like a storm of noise-burnt teeth. Bolter fire opened the symphony. The Devastator squads of his 4th Company spat death into the densely packed ranks of the Xenos. Each volley tore gaps in the wave, causing bodies to stagger, fall and collapse under the stomping boots of their own brood. But as always with this species, losses were merely fuel. Rockets screeched. A stray volley of projectiles struck a roaring Nobs in the chest, knocking him backwards. Yet his body still managed to knock over 2 more orcs before it lay still. The valley began to fill with smoke. Pantalus stood in the front line of cover, not withdrawn to the command center. He believed that a captain had to be seen, had to be felt like an anchor. His brothers should know that he had the same dirt under his boots as they did. The first wave of orcs reached the edge of the Imperial barriers. Activate close combat sectors, Pantalus ordered. His energy sword, Lex Ultima, awakened with a bright hiss. Blue energy danced across the blade, casting ghostly reflections across the skull icon on his chest. The bolter rested in his left hand, its familiar weight like a piece of his own armor. The first orc to leap over the barricade still wore the remains of an Imperium officer's cloak as a trophy. Pantalus ended its existence with a precise diagonal cut without even glancing at it. The energy of the blade simply caused the Xenos' primitive armor to fail. The body fell as if someone had cut the thread that held it to this world. To his right, Brother Gunners laughed. It was not a happy laugh, more of a hoarse, fanatical rattle. "For Gilliman!" he roared, before whirling into a furious slash. No excess, Pantalus warned, even though he knew the order would be lost in the noise of battle. Discipline was a mantra. It was repeated even when no one was listening anymore. Orc after orc crashed into the Ultramarines' line. The valley filled with cries of pain, the clang of metal, the howl of power weapons. Above it all was the steady bark of Volters, like the heartbeat of a dying planet. Despite all the chaos, despite the apparent confusion, Pantalus saw order, vector lines, opportunities, risks. His mind, trained by the Codex Astartes, laid an invisible grid over the battlefield. Every movement of his brothers, every advance of the orcs, every topographical irregularity found a place in a silent calculation. The math wasn't good. Second wave in 12 minutes, Macarian reported. Alignment north-northwest, more heavy infantry, many, very many. Pantalus nodded, though the sergeant couldn't see him. Confirmed. Hold, we've bought time. That's enough for now. He knew it was a lie, but lies, he had learned, could become weapons. If they did what weapons had to do: protect, focus, kill. Chapter 2, Sand in the Hour. Later, when the first wave had broken and the orcs briefly retreated to rot in front of the Imperial lines like a living shield wall of bodies, Pantalus stood in the half-destroyed command bunker. Hololith projectors cast flickering maps into the air, distorted by dust. The Voxed officering tech marine babbled litanies of stabilization as his mechadendrites readjusted the equipment. Pantalus paid little attention. An inconspicuous detail caught his eye: the small adamantium hourglass on his belt, its fine, not entirely natural particles forming immeasurably constant flow. He turned it, letting the sand fall again. "How long, brother captain?" Macarian stepped beside him, his helmet lenses glowing faintly. "Until reinforcements arrive," Pantalus's voice remained calm, "or until we run out of ammunition." "Both." "Too long for the first, too short for the second." He turned the hourglass again. "The orcs will advance. Our only chance is to make ourselves costly enough for them." "We could fall back," Macarian suggested, "to the inner bastion. More cover, tighter field of fire." "And leave the evacuation area unprotected?" "No." The words fell hard. "We stay where we are. The civilians on Casturis didn't ask to be dragged into this battle." Macarian was silent for a moment. "They don't even know we're here." "That's irrelevant," Pantalus replied. "We know." He thought briefly of Talithar, of the ruins of his home colony, of the feeling of being alone in the midst of an overwhelming enemy. A boy, dirty, covered in blood, too shocked to cry. And then the shadow of violet-blue armor. A helmet with glowing red eyes, bending over him. "You are safe now," a voice had said back then. "We are the Ultramarines. We never leave until the civilians are safe." Those words had stayed with him like a brand. "Prepare the men," said Pantalus. "We'll have to let them get closer in the second wave. We don't have enough ammunition for long-range volleys." Macarian saluted curtly and left the bunker. Pantalus looked at the hourglass. The sand was running out. He wasn't thinking about his own time. He was thinking about Casturis and about everything that would come after. Chapter 3, The Captain's Cry. The second wave was no storm. It was a flood. It did not come in orderly streams, but as an unmanageable mass of green, metal, smoke, and brutal determination. Orc banners fluttered, hung with skulls, chains, and torn-off arms. Growling, screeching vehicles, patched together monstrosities made from Imperial scrap, howled across the ravaged terrain. "Target priority, vehicles," Pantalus commanded. "Rockets and plasma cannons, everything we've got." The first salvo hit. An improvised battle tank exploded in a dirty fireball, hurling glowing pieces of metal into its own horde. A buggy overturned and lay there as a smoking wreck, but for every vehicle destroyed, 2 more appeared. By the time the orcs finally reached the barricades, there was hardly a line to speak of. It was a torn, broken barrier in several places. Pantalus stood on a pile of rubble, his armor already splattered with dirt and the dark blood of the Xenos. His power sword burned like a fragment of a dying star. His brothers fought around him, but he had eyes only for the gap in the center where the orcs were pushing hardest. A bolt grenade struck his shoulder plate, a ricochet from the crowd. The armor absorbed the blow, but the impact sent a vibration through his entire body. He ignored it. A huge knobs leaped at him, a combination of muscle, scrap metal, and primitive trophies. Pantalus took half a step toward him, parrying the powerful blow with a movement that looked as if he had practiced it 1,000 times. The energy blade slid under the orc's clunky shoulder armor, a jerk, a completion of the movement, and the enemy simply collapsed. But there were more and more. The barricade broke at several points simultaneously. Pantalus saw brother gunners being torn to the ground, disappearing under a living avalanche of green. He heard the sharp, broken prayer of another brother somewhere before the Vox channel spewed nothing but static interference. Something inside him snapped. He felt no pain, no fear, only an overflowing burning rage that manifested itself somewhere between his heart and his larynx. Pantalus had never been a man to raise his voice when it wasn't necessary. Discipline began with control, as he had often told his sergeants. Now, in this burning, collapsing valley, he let go of that control, and the world responded. His scream was not a human sound, amplified by his helmet's vox amplifier, carried by the metal acoustics of the valley. It sounded like the cry of an ancient war machine, like the wrath of a forgotten Primarch. The orcs faltered. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough. "Ultramarines," Pantalus roared, "form up here and now." His brothers responded. Even those close to collapse instinctively joined his position. Amidst the chaos, a new line emerged out of nowhere. Not a perfect rectangle, not a codex diagram, but a line. Per ordinem, the words were more of a growl than a shout. Et Per Gloriam thundered the reply. Bolter raised, blades raised, a last desperate shield against the flood. This was the moment that every picked feed, every servo-skull archive image, would later freeze on. Captain Boris Pantalus, blood spattered, armor scratched, arms raised to the sky, the cry of his faith louder than any war horn. And around him, a burning world. Chapter 4. The Trice of Order. The second wave broke. Not completely. Orcs rarely did that, but enough to force a brief, precious standstill. Debris, bodies, and clouds of smoke formed a bizarre landscape of obstacles and losses. Pantalus breathed heavily. His armor reported microfractures, damaged servos, dwindling energy reserves. "Status report," he demanded. Voices responded. Some clear, others strained. Squad here wiped out. Squad there reduced to half strength. Devastator section almost out of heavy ammunition. Apothecarius, radio silence. Apothecarius? Pantalus asked. No answer, only the crackle of overloaded vox channels. He knew the meaning of silence. Captain, Macarian finally reported, "We have less than 40 brothers. Fit for duty. 40 out of nearly 100 originally." Pantalus closed his eyes briefly. 40 warriors of the Ultramarines were still a force that could save worlds. But not against what lurked out there. Not against a third wave. Not against the mega ones that were already hiding somewhere in the dust, gathering target coordinates. "The evacuation?" he asked. Another voice, presumably that of an exhausted Astra Militarum officer, joined the network. "3 transporters to the north are still on their way. The rest are taken off, sir." "And they'll get through?" asked Pantalus. "If you keep the orcs here, yes." He thought of the hourglass, to every single particle that fell. Sometimes mercy was a matter of seconds. Sometimes it was a matter of hours. "Then we'll hold," he said, "until the last transporter breaks through into orbit." "Captain," Macarian interjected, "that will cost us." "I know what it will cost us." It was not a heroic moment, not a fiery speech. It was a sober observation. Order was not glamorous. It was not spectacular. It was the cold, systematic sacrifice of possibilities until only the one that could be accepted remained. And for Captain Boris Pantalus, that was the one in which others were allowed to live on. Chapter V. Silence after the fire. The third wave came as he had expected, slower, heavier, with more metal and less flesh. The orcs had learned. That made them more dangerous. But the Ultramarines had learned too. They were no longer fighting to hold the valley. They were fighting to steal time. Every minute they stood their ground was a minute in which somewhere above Castoris, a transport corrected its course for safety. Every brother who fell here was a weight on the scales against 10,000 innocents. Brother Arthon was one of those brothers. Pantalus found him in a crater that had once been a gun emplacement. The Marine's armor was torn open, fatally damaged internally. The medical data accessed by Pantalus's helmet spoke for itself. Arthon lifted his head with difficulty. "Sir." Pantalus knelt beside him, the battlefield in the background now just a distant cacophony. In that moment, there was only this one brother, and the inevitable shadow of his end. "You fought well," said the captain. "The Emperor has seen your service." Arthon smiled weakly behind his blood-stained breathing mask. "Then I did not bleed in vain." "Never," replied Pantalus. Arthon struggled with the words. "Sir, I don't want to lie here and hear what happens next." Pantalus understood. His hand rested reassuringly on Arthon's chestplate. "You know the right." The Marine nodded. "With honor." "With honor," Pantalus repeated. He spoke the prayer quietly, almost inaudibly beneath the thunder of distant explosions. It was a simple prayer. It did not ask for salvation, nor for reward, only for meaning, for the certainty that the death of a warrior was part of a greater whole. When the prayer ended, Pantalus did what had to be done. Later, some might say he had fulfilled his duty. He himself did not see it as duty. It was an act of mercy and at the same time, another number in a silent, austere calculation. Another grain of sand in the hourglass. Chapter 6. The Pantalus Maneuver. When the last evacuation transport broke into orbit, the 4th Company was already deep in the retreat sectors of its own plan. The Pantalus Maneuver, 3 staggered retreat rings, each with prepared explosive charges overlapping fields of fire, selected sacrifice positions, was never meant to be pretty. It was mathematical grace. The orcs advanced each time a line fell, storming into spaces Pantalus had already abandoned. Building complexes collapsed behind them. Explosive charges tore open trenches that separated them. Artillery, long since switched to automatic fire, bombarded zones where Imperial defenders had once stood. Now there were only orcs. "Second ring is falling," Makarian reported. "Third ring won't hold," added another sergeant. "We're running low on ammo. The close combat lines are almost exhausted." "Then only we remain," said Pantalus. "Third line of command. Core squad." "If that's 12 brothers, sir." 12. Once a 4th Company had numbered in the hundreds. Today, there were a handful of warriors in a dying valley. "Enough," said Pantalus. "We don't need numbers anymore. Only time." The last ring consisted of a half-destroyed administrative building, once the seat of a governor, now just a shell of ruined grandeur. The Ultramarines entrenched themselves on the upper floors, in bullet-riddled conference rooms among broken hollow tables. "Captain," asked a young Marine who still had his first campaign in his eyes, "are we going to die here?" Pantalus looked at him for a moment. "The chances are high," he said honestly, "but that's not what matters." "What matters then, sir?" "That our decision has already been made." The young Marine nodded slowly, as if only now understanding what it truly meant to be an Astartes. Not immortal, not invincible, just determined. Chapter 7. The Final Hour. The orcs arrived. They stormed the administration building like predators who had finally smelled blood. Doors were blown open, windows smashed, walls torn down if they blocked the way. The air filled with dust, smoke, and the chaotic roar of the Xenos. The Ultramarines waited. Pantalus stood at the top of the stairs leading to the central conference hall. To his right was Makarian. To his left was the young Marine from earlier, whose name Pantalus now consciously engraved in his memory. Brother Etrion. "Remember," Pantalus said calmly, "not one step back. Not because we can't, but because we don't want to." His power sword hummed softly. The hourglass on his belt had no sand left. It had already run out. It now hung like an empty symbol on the metal ring. Time was up. What remained was decision. The orcs broke through. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a process of attrition, a controlled, brutal reduction. Every blow, every shot, every movement was aimed at gaining maximum time. Pantalus did not fight like a hero from a legend, but like a machine built solely to stop the clock. Etrion was the first to fall. A massive orc slammed him against the wall, and his armor couldn't withstand the impact. Pantalus watched as the young marine slid to the ground, the life status on his helmet display fading to black. He didn't have time to perform the rite of mercy. Another brother died, then another. Names flickered across Pantalus's internal logbooks. Deleted, deleted, deleted. Finally, only Macarian remained at his side. A good place to die, the sergeant observed. We're not dead yet, Pantalus replied. Not yet, Macarian confirmed, and the smile in his voice was not crazy, but calm acceptance. Pantalus's Voxlink flashed. Letzter Transporter hat den Orbit verlassen, meldete die Stimme des Astra Militan Offiziers. Castoris Evakuierung abgeschlossen. Die Flotte bereitet Exterminators Protokolle vor. Exterminatus. The word hung in the air, like a final judgment. Understood, said Pantalus. Elderfleet not to hesitate. Sir, you're still on the surface. Tell them not to hesitate, Pantalus repeated. This is a world that would only belong to the enemy. Better that it belongs to no one. The connection broke. Macarian looked at him. No chance of extraction? No meaningful one. The orcs pressed on, trotting over their own dead, as if they were mere bumps in the ground. Pantalus saw nothing in their eyes but instinctive lust for battle. He raised his sword. For the Emperor, he said quietly. For Guilliman, added Macarian. For Castoris, added Pantalus, so that no one can say it fell without a shield. They plunged into the final melee. Chapter 8. Ash, Rain. Later, much later, as fire rained down from orbit and transformed the surface of Castorus Secundus into a single seething scar, an orbital sensor briefly recorded 2 small glowing signatures, 2 points of blue energy fire encircled by red heat sources. Then there was only white noise. The exterminatus was carried out as the protocols demanded. Efficiently, definitively, without mercy. Cities, valleys, seas, everything disappeared in a veil of plasma and molten rock. The orcs died without understanding why. The last defenders died knowing exactly why. In a quiet shrine on Macragge, far away from the burning world, a candle flickered as the news arrived. A scribe of the administratum stood before a bare, high wall of polished stone. Engraved upon it were thousands of names of ultramarines, each accompanied by a small symbol marking rank and company. With a steady hand, the scribe made another entry. Boris Pantalus, Captain 4 Company. Next to it, the symbol of the hourglass. Below it, Per Ordinem Et Per Gloriam. He took a step back and looked at the engraving. At that moment, Pantalus was just another line in a never-ending archive. But for those who had survived, he was more. Epilogue Aftermath. Years later, in a training room at the Talisar Recruit Training Center. A young aspirant, with dirty hands and sparkling eyes, stood in front of a bulletproof glass pane. Behind it, in silent splendor, stood a suit of armor held in stasis. Blue, gold, marked by countless battles. On the chest, the winged skull. On the belt, the hourglass. On the knee, an engraved inscription, Pantalus. Veteran sergeant stepped up beside the boy. His voice was rough, but not unfriendly. Do you know the story of this captain recruit? The boy shook his head. He held a world long thought lost, long enough to save tens of thousands, said the sergeant. He didn't die because he had to. He died because he chose to stay. The boy was silent. And that, the sergeant continued, is what it means to be an ultramarine. Not seeking glory, not victories, but order, loyalty, and if necessary, a final cry in a world that burns. The boy looked at the armor, at the hourglass frozen forever in the moment between falling and fallen sand. A decision began to form in his eyes. Perhaps one day he would see his own name carved in stone on a wall. Perhaps he would wear the armor of another captain. Perhaps he would stand in the shadow of Boris Pantalus as part of a new fourth company. Whatever came next, the war continued. And somewhere in the databases of the Empire, one last noisy recording remained. An image of a captain in the midst of the inferno, his arms raised to the sky, his face contorted in a scream that with equal parts rage, pain, and unshakable faith. A scream that said, Per Ordinem Et Per Gloriam. And that was enough.